Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Let's Talk Privacy and Technology series, where we chat with leading practitioners in the privacy and technology space and talk about things like privacy tech and privacy enhancing technologies, privacy engineering, and today, voter privacy and election security. As you know, I'm Lourdes Turrecha. I am the host of this series and the Privacy Tech and Law Fellow at Santa Clara Law's leading privacy law program. With the upcoming elections, I've been really looking forward to today's episode in particular. And amongst other things, my guest here today and I will be talking about election security and voter privacy. We have today none other than Joseph Lorenzo Hall, who is Senior Vice President of 4 Strong Internet at Internet Society. Joe, welcome to the series and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of course. I wanted to start us off with a question that was prompted by a post that you recently had on Twitter. It's not controversial. I stumbled upon while I was preparing for this episode. For the audience, what is a policy technologist and what does your work look like as one? And how did you end up, being one?
That's the most awesome question ever. Thank you so much. So I think there's 3 people that call themselves policy technologists right now. And I think it's Ross Schulman, myself, Ross Schulman from OTI, New America OTI, and myself and somebody else. Anyway, whatever. So there's like 3 of us, right? But there's a big movement right now that people may be more familiar with around public interest technology and public interest technologists. And Ford Foundation is leading this based on their experience in the 70s having created public interest legal clinics and a whole sets of public interest kinds of service provision. And the idea being with the public interest technologist movement that we really need people with technical skills that can think about the public interest in their work and work towards the public interest in their work. I, a long time ago, started using the term sort of policy technologist, which I think of as kind of I'm not sure if that's something within public interest technology or an umbrella over it or whatever. But I kind of think of it as technical, and I don't even think of it as technical people. I think of it tendently as people who have technical inclinations that just are big policy nerds, people who want to apply their technical expertise or know-how in the policy arena where OMG, it could really use some help often, right? It's getting better, but with some of these policymakers, it can be kind of painful to watch them sort of work through the implications of some of the decisions they're making. And you want someone next to them to actually say, hey, this is what is really going to happen if you do that. So I guess that's sort of what I think of as a policy technologist. I got into it, and I'll be real brief. Back in the day, I was an astronomer. I modeled planetary atmospheres in Fortran 77. Do not recommend it. And I saw my future PhD advisor, Pam Samuelson from Berkeley, a law professor, give a whole talk about how this one law, the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, was inhibiting cryptography research. And I was like, who would write a law to mess with researchers? Well, how naive was I then? There's plenty of laws that mess with researchers. But I think that sort of made me realize that there's a lot you can do as a technical mind in these areas to help people just do a better job of making decisions and setting up policies.
I couldn't agree more. I particularly like one of the descriptions that and I don't remember where it came from, maybe you can remind me, but one of your descriptions of what you do, which is that, I help government get tech right and tech get government right. And like you said, we've seen a lot of those congressional hearings with senators just drowning in questioning tech CEOs because they don't understand technology, right? And vice versa, right? A lot of technologists don't understand policy. And in my opinion, we need people in between who can bridge that gap. So folks like you, so thank you for dedicating your career to this. So at Internet Society, you oversee the Strong Internet Initiative. Can you talk to us about what the work entails?
Oh yeah, sure. So the Internet Society has been around for, I think, 25 years. I've been there for a year, so I should know how long we've been around for. And we focus on internet policy, so internet infrastructure, and specifically, we work towards making sure that the internet is for everyone, and that what we mean by the internet is, an open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy internet, and that everyone should have those kinds of things. There's two parts of that at the Internet Society. We call ourselves ISOC. I don't know what that's an abbreviation for, but whatever. But at the Internet Society, there's sort of two thrusts. The first is building or growing the internet. And the second is strengthening the internet. So I'm the strengthening person. I'm not very big or strong. To start, on the building side and the growing side, something like it's almost a little less than 50% of all people have no access to the internet in the world. And it's the easiest way to sum up a lack of access is that every day of not having a network connection is a day of missed opportunity. It's a day you can't look up something you might want to know on Wikipedia, which may sound trivial, but it may make a difference in your life and your business and a whole bunch of other things. But it goes all the way to being able to sell stuff online, right? So we really have to make sure that we can build networks out to people. And so on that side of Internet Society, it involves building community networks in very strange places that have no connectivity, like Nepal, across mountains, and building these things called internet exchange points, which are these little buildings that networks can get together to make sure you keep more traffic local. Anyway, on the strong side, the stuff that I do, it's all about security, privacy, resilience. And so there's 5 projects under what I do. 2 of them are policy projects, and 3 of the projects are technical projects. So you can see there's a little bit of tech and policy and all of this stuff, right? The technical projects include routing security. So this is, the internet, all the networks on the internet announce, hey, if you want to come to this IP address, come over here. And all these announcements all these networks are making are completely insecure. And so any network can announce that it's the way to get to anywhere on the internet. And we've seen that happen, like in the 2000s, Pakistan got mad at YouTube and decided to announce that they were YouTube. And it took Pakistan off the internet for about 24 hours because they cannot handle the traffic that YouTube generates. So the routing security project is all about making sure we can secure these announcements so that you don't go to the wrong place on the internet. The other 2 technical projects, there's one on time security. And so the way that your phone or your device knows what time it is it looks at something called network time. And that is completely insecure, totally unauthenticated. And we just this year, this standards body finished what's called NTS, the secure version of the network time protocol. And so we have a project around advocating for and trying to build out more network time security. The other one is about open standards. And to get to the policy projects really quickly, there's an encryption project. It was all about advocating around the world for end-to-end encryption and the importance for this glue that holds our digital lives together that all the decision makers in the world seem to have in their sights lately. And then another one called the Internet Way of Networking. This is a little hard to explain, but the idea is that the internet is special. We all have this kind of feeling that it's special. It's special in good and bad ways. But how has it been around for so long? 35 years since NSFNet this year, and allowed such innovation, such generative creativity, and all these kinds of things. So this year we actually sat down and said, what makes the internet like this? And so we have this thing called the Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit that lays out 5 critical properties of how the internet works. And if you look at them, you will see that you can use this as a ruler against policy proposals that might do something to the internet, like all these Section 230 proposals we've heard. You can actually use this to decide, hey, is this going to make the internet damaged in some way that we might care about? Like, does it mean we're going to have less of this kind of a thing on the internet or more of this kind of a thing on the internet? As we're hopeful that sort of ruler kind of a stick might help people actually look at policies and have a way of predicting what might happen to the internet if you actually do those things.
Thank you for that summary. And you're absolutely right. We've seen, standards like those are important. At Santa Clara, we have a strong internet law practice with Professor Goldman uh, being very vocal about Section 230 and his defense of it and whatnot. And yes, it's, yeah, outside of privacy, that's been one, Section 230 has been one of those internet issues that's been highly contentious today. And so, it's important work, right? It seems like we're having all of these coming up all at once, and I really don't understand why we're focusing on this as opposed to the pandemic, and why uh, our senators are paying attention to something that, I mean, it is an important issue, obviously, but right now I think it's, having a response to COVID-19 is more urgent than ever. But anyway, I got sidetracked there. How did you end up dedicating years on election security and voter privacy? I read from my research that you did your PhD dissertation on, I believe it's policy mechanisms for increasing transparency in electronic voting. And was that what kind of thrust you into that space for a while, or were there other things that inspired your work in this space?
Yeah, so you'll have to make sure I don't talk too much because I could talk about this forever. But um, voting is really special to me. It became even more special to me right when I was getting out of astrophysics. So around, and I have this somewhere, it's hilarious, but whatever, right around 2001 or 2002, I was at Berkeley and moving from the Department of Astrophysics to the School of Information. Um, and around that time, I got in trouble. I got a cease and desist letter from Jones Day, a 512 DMCA letter, that was forwarded to me by University Counsel at Berkeley, that said, you have on your website our copyrighted material. We under 512, you must take it down, blah, 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 blah. What was this? This was a bunch of us, grad students and undergrads across the country, someone had broken into Diebold election systems, which used to be a voting machine maker back in the day, and stolen about 6 years of internal email list traffic. And we didn't know what was in here because it's so massive, who's going to actually read that stuff, but we knew there's probably something bad in there. And so what we did is and I haven't seen this since, but we started something I call, and was at the time called a whack-a-mole protest, where we had one student put this huge archive of emails up on their web server, and when a cease and desist letter came in, we would take it down and somebody else would put that up, and we had this sort of list of students that would one by one put these up, and I was like number 5. Derek Slater, if anyone knows him, was like number 1. This is how he got into all this crap. He's at Google. He's a good guy. And so like, so I got this cease and desist letter, and I realized, wow, geez, man, they really don't want people to know this stuff. And like, I just sat through a fair use lecture where I was like, do they legitimately think they've got like an economic market for 6 years of email traffic? Like they're gonna sell that shit? Excuse my language, but like, no one's gonna do that, right? Long story short, EFF won one of the first 512F cases, the when you're abusing the takedown notice mechanism, by proving that essentially they had no intention of doing anything with this, that was, it was sort of an abuse of that mechanism. But that started to make me realize, why do they care about this so much? And about 2 months later, the Secretary of State of California decertified all of the Diebold voting machines because one of these emails showed that they had updated the software on this voting machine in the field about 2 weeks before an election, which is completely illegal. You're not allowed to change the code running on a voting machine. Like there's a whole very complicated process and requires federal certification, blah, 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 to do that stuff. And then I started to realize like, oh, wow, this is a carpet under which there are a ton of cockroaches. And if you're a grad student, that means there's a lot of really good problems to work on. And so when I talk to people about my thesis, which you said the title of, I typically tell people, I hacked voting machines for my PhD. Well, it's not really that. I mean, we did some of that, but it was really more about trying to figure out, if we have to have these black boxes counting our votes, what's the best way to keep them honest? And, and so the chapters in my thesis, which I do not recommend you read, never read anyone's PhD thesis. It's pretty much always a trash fire, whatever. But if you look at these chapters, here's one way to do it, through examining the contractual relationships between the jurisdictions and voting machine vendors. Here's another one, open source. Do we mandate that these voting systems must have open source code? Really interesting issues there with legal issues with Fifth Amendment takings of intellectual property, which is really cool. Like there is Monsanto's a famous case where the EPA published some trade secrets of Monsanto's, probably some pesticides, and they had to compensate Monsanto for essentially unilaterally publishing a trade secret, right? And source code from voting machines apparently claims trade secrets. If you've ever seen it, oh my God, it's a hot mess. Like you would not want to play with that code. It's just horrible. Anyway, so it's a long-winded way of saying that through this weird interaction with the DMCA takedown mechanism, I got really interested in this. And to sum it up really quick, Deirdre Mulligan at Berkeley and I joined a team that asked the NSF for $10 million about a year later, and we got $10 million from the NSF, and that funded my PhD. It funded a bunch of other PhDs of people that no one here probably knows. But that was essentially, I mean, you have to find something that people care about, and the NSF really cared about voting at the time. The weird thing is when I graduated in 2008, no one cared about voting anymore. So like you become a PhD student, you become super specialized, and I did like 60 faculty applications and got one interview. Then I realized I think I need to do something that's not academic. And now I'm here. Anyway, sorry. I could talk forever and you don't want me to.
No, and it's, you know, it's in again, right? Like everyone cares about the elections right now. And you've been thinking about this and working in this space for almost 20 years. And, you know, election insecurity and election fraud comes up almost every election, but it's come up quite a lot this election cycle. And so just based on what you've seen in terms of voting tech from the last 20 years, are you, and what you've, you know, your own observations as someone who has worked in this space and studied this space, are you particularly concerned this election cycle, or is it more like, you know, this happens every time, right? There will always be election security issues every election. And we talked about how, you know, there's different voting tech with, you know, within the 88,800 jurisdictions that we have in the US. I mean, yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts about that and how this might be just the same or different from prior cycles.
I'm going to take a moment and recognize you are so well prepared and you are asking such good questions. Like this is probably one of the best interviews I've ever had ever. Anyway, so with that being said, it's true. I started this and I started doing election stuff around 2002, 2003. And it really was unfortunate because at the time we go to raise money to do things, whatever, like people only cared about elections in even number years divisible by 4, you know, the presidential election years. And then they would not care at all. And sometimes they only want to give you money like 3 months before the election. It's like, what the heck can I possibly do with your money 3 months before an election? I don't know, right? And so that's just a way of saying there's this used to be this very episodic kind of attention that correlated with the presidential election year when people start to care. That, you know, I remember being so frustrated by this in 2014 or 2015. I was like, you know, the election space is kind of like a meadow with, you know, election officials, these little bunnies hopping around. And it feels like there's these big invisible bears that are going to eat these bunnies and we can't see them. And I was like, you know, maybe what election security needs is real adversaries, you know, because for the longest time, what you would catch are errors, or like, for example, in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, one time the election officials pre-shuffled decks so they would already know the answer. So there's weird fraudulent kinds of things where someone's just trying to save time. They're not trying to affect the election. And so I had said, maybe what we need is adversaries. Come 2016, geez, did we ever get adversaries? And like, that's when the episodic attention to elections stopped. And it has been pretty solid ever since in terms of funding, in terms of care. The Democracy Fund, if anyone cares about funders, attention to this, came huge and have just an amazing team of Jennifer Morrell, Tammy Patrick. I'm not name dropping. I just want to make sure these people get credit. And so it's, I guess the way I would say it is like, it's different. It's always going to be different. And the reason it is because this is fundamentally a security problem, a cybersecurity problem, is that, you know, our capabilities change all the time. Our capabilities to defend the people who are attacking, their capabilities change all the time. so it's always going to be a little bit different. Like in 2016, I was really upset that the intelligence community hadn't told election officials that they had caught Russians trying to spearfish a election services vendor. You know, and the reason that's important is because a lot of us are arguing, hey, don't run your own stuff. You should use G Suite, Google. You should use O365. They're going to be much better at protecting the security than you are. And so people say that like, well, we should be using these vendor products rather than maintaining them ourselves. But then the vendor gets popped, and that's a way you get into all of Florida, for example. So, you know, there were some real wrinkles in 2016. I am really excited that that has been, and for the communication issues between local election officials, states, and like the DHS and CISA and the Election Assistance Commission. It's not perfect, but it is amazingly better. You see DHS, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Information Security. I forget what I forget what that actually stands for, but you see them coming out with much more timely targeted notions about even like ransomware attacks that may not even be targeted at election, but they're targeted at local governmental entities, which is a great place for ransomware to target because they always have insurance that will pay for ransomware. Insurers should just stop paying for ransomware, unfortunately. So I feel like it's much better this year. It's always hard to know what you're truly facing in terms of the adversaries. And not only that, the adversaries seem to have different interests this time around, rather than the Russians being so into Trump in the past. There seem to be different national adversaries that favor different candidates in this case, right? And so it's hard to know if that just means more chaos, which is bad, or if those things tend to cancel each other out, like on the disinformation sphere. So I'm hopeful. I'm really hopeful too that people are aware that this is important, and they're not to sound partisan, but people are making a plan. They're thinking about, I need to make sure that my vote gets in, and the people I care about, that their vote gets in, and that's really the only thing we can do as individuals on some level is make sure we get our votes in and count, and that we encourage other people to vote too, right?
Amen. I mean, exactly. Let's get out our votes and make sure that they do count this election, right? And learn from previous election cycles. You mentioned earlier the federal certification process, and it's also something that we chatted about. And as I understand, they also have those at the state level when it comes to voting tech. Can you talk to us more about this and the potential for, security and privacy pitfalls during this process? Is it a process that is mature? It sounds like it's gone better over the years with awareness and election security becoming a mainstream issue that we've talked about since 2016. Have you seen it gotten better? What does that entail today?
These are the best questions. Okay, so when you're working in a legal clinic or like on the front lines, it's often so hard to see the impact of the work you're doing, and often you may never see it, and sometimes there's just no freaking impact, right? But like sometimes you see it later, and this is an example of where in when I was at Berkeley as a technical person, I would participate in the Samuelson Law, Technology, and Public Policy Clinic, a high-tech legal clinic at Berkeley. Where was I going with this? Geez, I just lost my train of thought. Oh, here it is. Okay. And so at the Samuelson Clinic, we wrote maybe 6 public comments, so specific to something called the Election Assistance Commission. The Election Assistance Commission was set up in the wake of the Bush v. Gore travesty to essentially do exactly what it says, to assist the country in doing better with elections. One of the things that I realized like about 2 or 3 years ago is that all these public comments we had written were public comments in response to an NPRM, a notice of proposed rulemaking from the Election Assistance Commission, and they are always about either the testing process and the standards or the testing manual, which is kind of like, okay, how do you actually test the dang device against those standards, blah, blah, blah. And it kind of felt like yelling into the wind for a long time, in the sense that we would say, hey, you really need to, bring in some security experts in here, or hey, that's not how you test this thing, or hey, sure, the military shake and bake tests that sort of shake things and heat them up and stuff, that's one thing, but that doesn't have anything to do with usability, accessibility, security. You want to have some sort of privacy test, something that's like, hey, are, for most people, do the screens go up high enough so where someone can't look around their shoulder? Anyway, so there's a whole bunch of things like that. And the testing regime as it is today is vastly better than what it was back then. And looking back at it, people who put in comments, us included, I'm not going to say we were directly a result of that, but the people who engaged really turned that certification program like a battleship to where it is now. And there's plenty of people I know in the election verification community, the people who really, really care about voters' ability to verify their votes. I'm part of that. I'm on the board of the Verified Voting Foundation and the California Voter Foundation. In the verification community, they have very high standards, as they should, for these things. And so I think people there would be like, well, it's not perfect. It's not perfect. There's a lot they could do. Just to highlight some of it. So for example, it's called the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines. And the whole idea is we can't impose upon states anything. And so the name even includes the word voluntary voting system guidelines. They're not standards, they're sort of guidelines. And states have various laws about if they require federal certification or any state certification. Some require both, some require just one, some require none, which is interesting in the sense you might think like, geez, everyone should require the same thing. I would say that on some level, but what that has allowed is, just like we see with the variation from state to state, it has allowed some laboratories to pop up. Just like California tends to be sort of a laboratory for certain kind of laws that roll out for the rest of the country. You see other places serving that role with voting systems. And so, for example, I'll use two quick examples. California has a process where you don't have to go through federal certification as long as you do certain things with your voting system. And what you have to do is you have to meet the state standards, and you have to run what's called a risk limiting audit after each election you run with this machine, which is awesome. Risk limiting audits are something that Philip Stark from Berkeley has pioneered. I did some of that work in my postdoc as well. But the whole idea behind a risk limiting audit, it's really cool. It's kind of like, I say this and everyone hates it when I say this, but I'm going to say it and you guys won't know why people hate it. It's kind of like a statistical recount. And what I mean by that is it allows you to know what you would get with doing a full recount without having to do the full recount by counting a subsample, a sample of the entire ballots. And what you do is you try and limit the risk that if you did count all the ballots, you would get a result that's different than what you announced. So the whole idea is you're trying to make sure that you announce the right result, because that's what we care about when it comes down to it. And if you don't have that certainty, this thing proceeds until you actually do a manual count of all the ballots. And so you either get to the right decision by definition, or you at least have the confidence that if you did do all that counting, you'd get the same result. So California is really interesting because they're like, okay, you can go through federal and state certification. There's another option, which is skip federal certification, go through state certification, and then you have to do this for every election. I used to be part of the LA voting system assessment, voting systems for all people. The acronym has changed a bunch. And they had used this process to some extent LA has a ballot marking device, basically a really expensive pen. You can think of it as you walk up to it, you make some choices, and it fills in the ovals on your ballot, right? But it does it in such a way that you won't make a mistake. And if you have any language or disability needs, the machine takes care of all of that. It's a really neat system, in my opinion. I helped with the group to design the thing. And then another example is so like LA, LA's bigger than many states combined, right? Like it's 5,000 voters, 5 million voters, 5,000 polling places, although it's different now under something called the Voters' Choice Act. So LA is huge. And what LA is doing, where they actually spent an amazing amount of money to build their own voting machine, that's kind of thinking about the high end of where this is going with big cities. Like, this is trying to solve voting at scale, so to speak. The other interesting thing about the voting for certification process, the other example I'll use is what Voting Works, a company that's an open source voting vendor with Benedita, who either you've spoke to or you will speak to at some point.
After the elections to
Cool.
continue the conversation.
Neat. So Ben, I am such an admirer of Benedita, who runs Voting Works, and all his team. They're just, I am blown away by what they've done, but they have availed themselves of the opposite, which is in some states that have really, really tiny jurisdictions, and you may have heard of, if you've heard him say this, like Louisiana has no federal and no state requirement. And so you can come in, and as long as you get the, whatever the local equivalent of approval is, and probably I think you have, the Secretary of State has to allow you to do it, you can run an election on a very new voting system that hasn't been through all the complicated, very expensive testing at the federal and state level. And so the Voting Works is on the other side of the scale, where they're trying to find these little towns, and you can, I think this is still the case, is you can go buy all the stuff you need to build a Voting Works voting system at Home Depot. And so that's something where they're trying to serve the smaller part of the market by not even using the certification process at all, but trying to, with evidence, prove that you should trust them. One, it's open source. You can go buy the stuff in Home Depot. And then they build in some of these auditing processes into their mechanism to sort of show you that, hey, this is all above the board. You know, we're a nonprofit vendor. We're not even out here to make a profit, right? We're out here to service election officials. Anyway, so that's a little bit of flavor. It's much more complicated, but let me know if there's anything else.
That's really fascinating. And there are a couple of things there that I wanted to follow up on. First, it sounds like, from what you just described, there's a lot of variations when it comes to state voting certification processes. And I thought that the federal would be a floor, but it sounds like some of them don't even require federal certification. So how does it even work? Who gets to pick what certification processes?
So states run elections, so states get a pick how this goes. In fact, sorry, I have my big mic, and so I'm moving around. It may be too loud. In fact, before the federal government ran certification, something called NASED ran certification. That's the National Association of State Election Directors. And so it used to be sort of like a group of election officials would get together and approve or not approve of these things. But you're right, there's no floor. That's why the Election Assistance Commission hopes that their certification process is sort of fit for purpose and everyone says, yes, we'll all use that. But for a variety of reasons, people don't use it. One, maybe they just don't trust the feds, I don't know. But there's others, like, for example, I don't think this is now the case, but 4 or 5 years ago, it used to be the case that it was really time consuming and really expensive to go through the federal process. Like typically a new voting system, it would be, I think it was 2 years and something like $2 million. And you think about computers, a computer these days you stick in the front of a 2-year process, you can't go buy that computer 2 years later. And so it's like, that's kind of broken, right? But I think my impression is now that they have it's much quicker, and they try not, it's not as expensive. But then again, there are people at the EAC we could ask about this that would have the most late stuff, but I don't have it in my head, sorry.
No, thank you. That clarifies a lot of things for us. We talked about Ben and his startup Voting Works. My next question is somewhat, tangential to that, and I'm curious, as a technologist, what privacy or voting tech product or feature do you wish existed and wish was out there for this election cycle? And you can be as playful as you want or creative as you want.
I was thinking about this earlier. I really want there to be a private, this is not related to the elections, but I'll get to the elections in a sec. I really want there to be a private browsing mode for things that aren't browsers. So like my car, if I don't want like the network to know if I'm going to like Francis Ford Coppola's favorite vineyard because he's taking me there. I don't know that guy, whatever. That would be cool to be able to do, right? Maybe your smart home has a private living mode for like, maybe there's an hour where the network doesn't know what you're up to in your house on a Friday night or something like that. I don't know, right? But for elections, gosh, there's this sweet spot in election technology, and we had thought we had got it with the LA County machine that was universally accessible, which not only means usable, but that pretty much someone with any disability could walk up to it. It's not exactly true, because if you're deaf blind, if you have both deaf and blind impairment, there's very few kinds of, there's actually one voting machine that you could use, but there's just very few ways to do that, to support those kinds of disabilities. So there's, in my head, there's the perfect voting machine. And it is something that satisfies all the security experts, satisfies all the election officials, and that it's a cute little thing that they can move around if people are 80 years old and pick up, right? It satisfies like the entire disability community. And that just doesn't exist. And unfortunately, it really doesn't exist for overseas voters, right? We have, at the Internet Society, we have staff in 28 countries. Some of them are expat Americans who live in like Ethiopia, for example. And man, getting a ballot back in time to be counted from a place like Ethiopia or wherever, I mean, people are worrying already this year about the integrity of our postal service. You can imagine that with COVID, that it's pretty bad throughout the rest of the world. And there are groups like the Overseas Voter Foundation, Susan Dizeskia Swina, I probably did not say that right. Susan Diaz runs that, and she raises money to make sure people could courier back their ballots via FedEx, DHL, whatever, so you don't have to go to an embassy if you're in the middle of nowhere, as long as you can get close to those kinds of places. And the reason that it's important to think about those users is because right now, the technology that seems to be winning over election officials is internet voting on the freaking blockchain. Internet voting is bad. The blockchain should only be used for financial transactions, in my opinion, but I'm not an expert in blockchain. I'm an expert in voting machines, and it's the last thing anyone should be thinking about wiring up their voting machine with. It's just totally stupid. And Bradley Tusk and others are obsessed with this stuff. And it is really unfortunate because it's a distraction, and it's pulling venture capital money away from things that could actually make a freaking difference. That was a little bit of pie in the sky, perfect technology, and what I don't want. So sorry, I kind of answered your question how I wanted to.
I'm with you on the, just the general tech, either like a do not track or private browsing tech for everything else. I mean, we've seen that in the browser space, and I mean, even private browsing is not really private, right? But we saw, GPC come out a couple of weeks ago with the global opt-out. So I'm with you. I want everything else.
There are really amazing fictional versions of these things. So like Kevin Bankston at Facebook got me into science fiction, and so did a few other people, but so I've been reading it for a very, very long time. And there's this book called The Quantum Thief by Paglio Bacigalupi that talks about essentially there's a cryptographic mechanism in the space around you, but there are these designated parts of the world that are built to never record anything. And so you can go get privacy in these certain parts of the world. And I'm like, I would like it not to be that. It's beautiful and it sounds great and everything, but I would like, it seems like privacy is never going to die, because we're always going to, have, what do you call it? Secret birthday parties, and stuff like that. And that's fine. The state doesn't need to know about that stuff. Anyway, sorry, I'll get all worked up.
Yeah, the undying death of privacy, as Daniel Solove puts it, right? We've had people for more than a century say privacy is dead, just book titles, article titles, and news media. I mean, newspaper reports, and he basically, took a snapshot of all of those throughout the century, and newsflash, privacy is not dead yet.
Not even close.
Exactly. And just I wanted to follow up on the blockchain voting tech. I saw a couple of those last year at TechCrunch Disrupt. I think Unum ID was one of them. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but I'm going to take a break from my questions because we have a couple from the attendees. And so thank you guys for submitting these. I'm going to read one of them. So the first one says, in the civic tech space, the idea of digital twins have been touted as a way of modeling how local governments work. Is this something that ISOC, the Internet Society, has worked on? And if so, are there any general privacy takeaways or considerations that should be taken into account? And thank you for the question, by the way.
I have no idea what a digital twin is. if
I don't.
JL, if you wanted to actually say some words about what a digital twin is.
Yeah, let's wait for that one. The second question that we had was, how much of an effect do you think the current economy of ad tech or online surveillance has in voting, and are there any policy changes you would like to see to address this? I mean, we had that in 2016 with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. It's something that is highly debated today, with Twitter taking down, the Hunter Biden New York Post article yesterday. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. It's something
Yeah,
that,
that's a really good question. I had never thought about this, but it totally makes sense. Like, um, if there's one thing that ad tech and political strategy have in common, it's micro targeting and everything that goes within that stuff, right? And you can see why. People don't want to spend a lot of money on people they know aren't going to vote, right? And they do want to make sure they craft the perfect message, the one that you're like, huh, that's what it took to put me over the edge to vote for that person. As if there's anyone out there like that. Maybe there are. I doubt it these days. So that's really interesting, and you can see this because, like, there was a time where I think in the roll up to the 2016 election, the former head of HP, I forgot her name already, had a mix up in her targeting mailers, and people in LA got the wrong ethnic groups in their mailers. And so you'd get, a Hispanic family would get a happy black family on their mailer or something. And people were just like, oh, that's interesting. It's just different or whatever. But it was because they had kind of messed up their targeting algorithm. And then we also see this, and this is another just example. This is one where I actually got in trouble at work because Kate Conger, who's at the New York Times now, I love her to death, and Dale Cameron did a story on this, and they quoted me saying the MF word at the very end because I was so mad. Anyway, but this was a breach from a firm called Deep Roots, and so there's all these political targeting firms you can hire and spend a lot of money on that do these micro-targeting things. And a lot of them do this kind of analysis like a lot of us do on cloud systems with our data, because there's a lot of data. In this case, they had walked away from a database on Amazon and left it available, and it had 370 million records of US voters or something like that. Some of them were duplicates and stuff like that. But the interesting thing was, I didn't get to see this data, but I got to ask them questions about the data, and I knew exactly what I wanted to ask. And this is what came out of the questions was, there were 3 sets of data in this huge breach that didn't get a lot of attention, unfortunately, other than from my boss, Chris Calabresi, because I said the MF word, but that's fine. There were 3 sets of data. One was voter data, or voter roll data. So you can get this data from most states pretty easily if you just sign on the dotted line or give them some money. And it's, residential address, a variety of things about you, right? Your name, your party affiliation. In some cases in the South, they'll have your ethnicity, because that's sort of a condition of registering in VRA, the Voter Rights Act jurisdictions. So there's all this personal data there. Then there is survey response data. So when you go donate to Hillary Clinton back in the day at the time, or to Donald Trump at the time or whatever, they would say, thank you for donating. Please fill out this questionnaire. We really want to make sure, we're targeting the right people. And it would be things like, do you own a firearm? Do your neighbors own firearms? You can imagine having this survey data next to their home address. Firearms are not cheap things, and they're very dangerous things. There's definitely privacy implications there. Then finally, the last set, there was 3 pieces of data: this voter roll data, survey response data from their platforms and donations and stuff. And then the last one was appended data from data brokers. So when they really needed to get a piece of data that was not being provided, they would go buy it from a data broker and add it over here in this other part. Now, in some cases, and this is where it gets really scary, the missing data from the voter roll would be their physical address. In some states, there's 23 states that allow you, if you're a victim of domestic violence, a cop, a judge, variety of sort of sensitive roles, you're allowed to prohibit the disclosure of your residential address to these campaigns, because you really care about your physical security, right? And so in some of these places, there'll be just this one PO box in certain states that everyone knows that PO box means that they don't actually have an address. In some places, it just says NA, not available, or whatever. But in many cases, they would go and buy from data brokers the actual residential home address of these people who had them been suppressed. And so you could actually look at this data set, find anyone who had one of these ridiculous kinds of standard dummy residence addresses, remove everyone else, and you basically have serving suggestions for people who consider their physical address to be extremely sensitive. And we've seen, God, just recently we've seen federal judges and their families attacked by people that have been in front of them in court, right? And this is, you can't have a society if you have those kinds of problems. So anyway, I would say I'm not doing a good job of answering the question. I'm just sort of saying it's a really serious thread throughout all of this. What I don't know enough on the academic angle is, like, I know like people like Joe Turrecha at Pennsylvania have studied this kind of stuff, but it's mostly, it's not from a privacy and security angle. I think it's mostly from a, moving minds kind of perspective, but I could be wrong. But and so this is a place where I think there's ripe work ready to be done, especially in the policy sphere. Like, to what extent these tools get so strong that they do things that we don't think are in the public interest, right? Just like we have questions of bias in artificial intelligence, are there things that could happen with targeting platforms that could actually cause a civil war that we, I don't know, I'm just trying to be a little sensationalistic, but those are the things I worry about. And I don't know if we have a good feel, just like a past form of expertise of mine, global warming, there's a point past no return where we cannot cool the planet down. Once we've reached that point, we're screwed and we're going to look like Venus. I worry that with some of these tools, Venus is very, very hot. Sorry, Venus is, you think it's very pretty, but it's like 900 degrees. It's a horrible place to be. Sulfuric acid rain. Sorry, that's astronomer in me. But like, I worry with these tools that we also don't have a good feel for the potential envelope of the implications of our actions. Like, bias in AI is horrible, and it changes a bunch of people's lives. But this could be like, like in 2016, one of the threats we worried the most about around elections, like the thing that kept us up at night around elections, were essentially a distributed shooter scenario where some group of people were targeting polling places and randomly killing people, right? We actually thought about this at very high levels in 2016. And the problem with that, it's kind of like the rogue, the lone wolf kind of terrorist. There's just not a lot you can do once that thing happens to convince people that they're safe enough to come out and vote. And those are things we can sort of see. Those are sort of the known kind of unknowns. Like, we kind of know what would happen in those cases. But I worry that with the ad targeting in politics, that with the targeting mechanisms in politics, that we don't really have a good feel for what the potential implications could be if it goes really wrong. Like a Cambridge Analytica, but like, being directed like a howitzer by the Trump campaign or the Biden campaign, just because they have a ton of money and they only have it for a little bit of time and they got to spend it quick, right? Yeah, sorry.
You bring up so many challenges and issues with, voter privacy when it comes to sensitive populations and bias in AI. And so thank you for, the perfect transition to my next question. This actually, maybe to focus us a little bit more, what do you think is one of the most important privacy or security challenge that we're facing today? And I'd love to hear your thought about that. Other guests have their own opinions, but I'm curious to hear what yours is.
Yeah, and I would say linkability. That I'm increasingly, it's hard to convince people to care about anonymity, or to, even less strong versions of not being fully associated with your identity than anonymity may be, right? And I think people right now have this tendency to think that they go around online and that no one's watching them or who would care about them or whatever. And unfortunately, that all works until all of a sudden, you're on the news or whatever, and now people actually care about you, and you cared about the things you did with your new perspective and stuff. And I'm a little worried that we've very much gotten into privacy by design. And I like how, we're seeing a lot of that. Like, there there are privacy engineers in all of the major tech platforms, right? And that wasn't the case 5 or 6 years ago, right? And there's privacy engineering teams that are required to be consulted when you get a product through. And so, but linkability, and what I mean by linkability is like, if anyone paid attention, when the FCC was doing privacy rulemaking, there was a really fun fight about defining privacy as being anything linkable, linked or linkable to you, and a big academic fight about what does that word mean. I think it captures it really well. And essentially, people go around right now, and I don't think they. So I'm a physicist by training, and the way I think about it is, we have hundreds of thousands of years as humans with experience with optical light. These things coming through my glasses, it's bouncing off of me, going into a camera, going into the internet, going all the way over there, right? Like that's what's happening. We have a pretty good feel for the things we give off from optical light. Like, I spend time shaving, right? You may have done your hair, right? We do these things to make sure that when we're out in the optical light environment, that we look certain ways and then we can interact certain ways. Like, we wear clothes not because we have anything to hide, but because it makes it more comfortable for us to interact with each other in social, cultural, and economic interactions, right? Like, we've all decided, except for the nudists, but most of us have decided that that's what we're going to do. And when it comes to linkability, like, on some level, you have to think of this as, we're walking around the online environment without real appreciation of what we emanate, of what bounces off of us, literally with network connections, and what goes out to other people and what other people can observe. There are tools like Tor and private browsing and stuff that help us solve certain pieces of that and allow people to have the confidence that, if they're in a West African country where homosexuality is punishable by death or mob violence, that they can ask questions about the feelings they're feeling and stuff like that, right? And so I think we face some real challenges there with making sure we can give people the confidence that they can be in certain environments without these sort of linkable parts of their body and their past following them. And I think more importantly, we face the challenge, just like with end-to-end encryption, making the case that this shouldn't even be a question. People should, in their minds, be like, oh, of course, that's a fundamental primitive, as cryptographers would say. That's a fundamental building block of the digital society that we enjoy. We can't destroy those things. And I guess that's linkability is something that I worry about. And I know how to, at least in many cases, destroy links to me or around me. But man, it's getting harder and harder.
It is getting harder and harder. I mean, and become more difficult for individuals to do the same, because the way that we've built our tools today, we've built in a way to link people and track them online. And so, if I wanted to unlink myself to a lot of things, I have to pay for an app like my pseudo app. So I have pseudonyms online that I used to unlink different personas, for instance, that, I pay for that, and not everyone wants to pay for that, level of unlinkability, right? Joe, I feel like I can talk to you for more hours. So,
We could.
but fortunately, we're out of time. So I want to, maybe invite you to share any closing words, and maybe share with the folks we have listening in today and who will be watching the recording, how they can reach you if you want to be reached, and if they want to ask follow-up questions.
Sure, yeah. So I've said a lot, and I guess what I'll say is, if you want to reach me either for fun or for anything that the Internet Society is doing, please hit me up on email, hall@isoc.org, HALL@ISOC.org, or Twitter is, I'm probably much more responsive, which is really unfortunate. Why would I say that? That's horrible. Which is Joebeone, JOEBEONE. I guess this is a really neat series, Lourdes. This is amazing. Like, you've done so much. Like, I feel like I'm like in a living room with a long lost friend or something, who's clearly studied way too much of my work. It's kind of embarrassing, but it's flattering. And I guess what I'd say is, all this stuff, like, there's just little glimmering wonderful pieces of everything we've talked about. And if people are interested in sort of getting more involved, just pay attention, look for those things that you're interested in. Try, look, like, I read the entire Wikipedia article for time the other day, just because, like, I was like, okay, there's got to be some things I don't know that I want to, have in my head and use this for perspective. And so that's what I think is the thing I would emphasize, is to the extent that you're interested in this stuff, reach out. If there's things you think that I may have in my head that I can help you in your work or play, make the connections. That's often what I'm best at, is, making connections rather than like saying anything profound. Although you might think differently, Lourdes, apparently, and everyone else, thank you so much.
No, thank you, Joe. And thanks everyone. I look forward to, our next conversation.
Absolutely. Cheers. Thank you so much. I look forward to watching all these.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.